All right, we are back. Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey man, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, and joining us today is an electoral expert that we're going to consult, Aaron Kleinman. You know him as at Bobby Big Wheel on Twitter, or around the Majority Report offices as at Big Fat Daddy, which Sam said trying to remember what his at was. um, Aaron Kleinman. Aaron, welcome to Left Reckoning, and give yourself any more introduction you might want.
I don't know how I top Big Fat Daddy. I think that's what I'm calling Brian Daboll these days. I'm really excited for the no. Yeah. So while I'm not being called Big Fat Daddy at the Majority Report offices, I am the director of research at the States Project, which is a group that tries to connect the importance of state legislatures to basically every aspect of our lives and bring people together to help build a healthy, sustainable, and prosperous future for everyone.
Now, before I ask you about how this might have changed in the Biden era, what does it mean when you say you focus on states? Why?
Yeah. So state lawmakers in particular are the most powerful politicians that you probably haven't even heard of. States, and especially we really are seeing this now after the Dobbs decision and with kind of the threats to democracy. But states have really, and state legislatures in particular, have a very inherent power of policymaking that too often gets ignored. And so much energy and organizing takes place, especially at the federal level, but you can have just so much more impact at the state level. And one really good example of that is that, a competitive state legislative election costs something like 3% of a competitive Senate election. Just to give you a scope of kind of just like how much, how under-resourced they are relative to the federal level. And so, our mission is to kind of connect the work that, can be done in states to, people who want to make a difference in their communities.
Interesting. So now let's talk about a few narratives that we've heard going into this election season. The first one earlier in the year, which is that there's going to be a red wave. Everyone's sick of, Fauci authoritarianism and critical race theory. And then we have this post-Roe decision era. Like, do you have a read on which is it going to be a mix of both? Is it going to be Democrats saved by the Roe decision? What do you think about that? Just general headwinds leading into this election season.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned that there's been this kind of change in the conventional wisdom about what's going to happen in this election. And I actually, publicly and privately, I've been pretty consistent. I think it's going to be a pretty evenly split midterm election, and so that just makes it so that kind of pinpointing the areas that are going to be the closest really is going to be important. And we're doing that hard work every day, trying to figure out where the election is going to be the closest and helping out the candidates in those races. Now, kind of zooming out a bit, kind of, well, why have I been saying that? And it's, typically a party, when they hold the presidency, ends up losing seats in an election. The theory behind that being, they tend to overstep their mandate, they misread the electorate, and the other party can end up picking up seats. But what you saw in 2020 was you really didn't have that very much. I don't think anyone's really thinking that Joe Biden is governing outside of his mandate. But what you do have, particularly at the state level, is just you have a lot of far-right legislatures really threatening people's freedoms. And obviously, in light of the Dobbs decision, that's a big one, where you have you have laws that would prevent abortions, even if the life of the mother was at risk, even in the case of rape or incest, just really draconian, backward things that are really threatening to people. But you also have threatening, like even larger threats to freedom, where you have state lawmakers talking about how they can override the will of their own voters in choosing what happens in presidential elections. There's currently a case pending before the Supreme Court called Moore v. Harper, and I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically the North Carolina legislature, right-wing legislature, is saying we don't have to abide any limits on us from either the executive or judicial branches to set rules for elections. It's a really, and if the Supreme Court rules for them, and there's a good chance they will. It just totally unravels a lot of kind of checks and balances on legislatures. And the only way that we'll be able to really kind of ensure the freedom of to choose who you want representing you is to vote for, against far right state lawmakers. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, yeah. So let's start maybe there with zoom in. Where in sort of far right legislatures, red states, I guess colloquially they're called, but like, where would you like to start?
Yeah. So, and the thing is, like, a lot of states that went for Biden in 2020, they have Republican legislatures. You have New Hampshire as a Republican legislature, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania. All these states have Republican legislatures. Some of them it's due to gerrymandering. Others it's just due to the far right's been organizing at the state legislative level far longer, and they have a head start. But yet, those are kind of some of our key electoral states. Also, Minnesota is one of three states that has a split state legislature. And so we're trying to hold the House there while flipping the Senate as well. And so, and again, if you want to zoom into those states a little more closely, in the Arizona Senate, we just need to flip one seat and we'll break right-wing power there. That's it. We're so close. In Michigan, the state Senate there is one of the best pickup opportunities of the cycle because they used to have a Republican gerrymander in the state legislature there. In fact, Democrats got more votes in every state house election in Michigan in the past decade, in every election except for one. But it's so gerrymandered, they never got control. But they have an independent redistricting commission now, and they created maps that either party could win on for both chambers. And the Senate map is, particularly, representative of the state. We can win a majority on that. Pennsylvania is a state where we're in a bit more of a hole. We have to flip 12 seats in the House, but I mean, even making progress there is huge because, in Pennsylvania, also, if you're worried about post-election shenanigans, you can actually swear in state lawmakers in Pennsylvania in December, so it could prevent a 2024 kind of election theft if we can kind of win a power there over two cycles. And then New Hampshire, again, if we can win all the seats that Biden carried, we can, break right-wing control in the chambers there.
Is the sort of election integrity, is that more of a pronounced focus than the abortion stuff, as far as like prioritizing state legislators, or are these two different goals basically?
I say they're congruent, like basically protecting people's right to choose and picking their right to choose who they want representing them. They are intertwined because when you look at the right wing in this country, it's all about, it's a very kind of authoritarian movement, and that manifests itself in all sorts of ways. So when you're going up against that, I mean, it's really letting people know that so many of their freedoms are being threatened right now in their state capitals. So obviously we're only backing candidates that we know will basically support both freedoms, both freedom to, choose and the freedom to choose who your representatives are.
Yeah, I mean, I just think like, one thing here in Texas that I've been trying to remind folks of is that, despite there being a matrix of like wide variety of opinions on, for example, the subject of abortion, the fact is that the state government here is legislating from like the extreme minority in the sense of people who want like an outright ban. And like, I do just totally agree that these things are very, congruent and like connected to say, we are having a fight right now, not just to decide what we want on certain issues, but whether or not we should have the ability at all to influence the people who make laws in our name.
Yeah. And I mean, and in Texas, I think it was particularly striking kind of the attacks on freedom there with SB 8, because that bill really was authoritarian in a way that you don't really see that much. It was turning neighbor against neighbor. It really was like an authoritarian state where people are kind of afraid of being snitched on by their friends and colleagues. I mean, that's not the type of state you want to live in. That's not the type of country you want to live in. That's what we're up against right now. And so, I see all of these freedoms that we're trying to protect as connected to each other.
Now you bring up Texas. Are you noticing anything? Blake Masters is throwing all of his chips on. He's going to be able to shave off enough Latino support that they're going to be competitive. What are you seeing with regards to, I guess, the sort of hashtag walk away from the Democratic Party from Latinos or any other, like women, anything like that?
You know, it I don't think that, right. I would say the what the far right was banking on heading into this election for months and months. I would say that them and the crypto people, if you go back a few months, it was the same thing that they were looking on. They were just line go up. And basically, they have been winding up for months on inflation is just going to keep going up.
Mhm.
Gas prices are just going to keep going up. And we can say or do whatever we want and we'll still be able to win. And now inflation is subsiding. Gas prices are going down and they're scrambling because they have nominated a lot of very far right candidates who are very out of step with their communities. There are candidates in swing states who are telling people to watch 2000 Mules in swing seats, I should say. That are doing QAnon hashtags. That believe, many ones who believe that don't think that the 2020 election was valid and want to overthrow it. I think one we saw was even asking to go to January 6th, even if she wasn't actually there. You have this, and so, I think what we need to do right now is kind of highlight for people, hey, you have a very far right and kind of, a far right party very out of step with you. And like, there are a lot of people who might have voted Republican at the state level for a while, even if they kind of got increasingly, disgusted with Trump. And, and I think, what the message is like, whatever you didn't like about Trump, for the people who, didn't like Trump, but, it's here. And by the way, if people who voted for Trump they thought he was going to bring back jobs, or thought he was a good businessman. It's like, well, and they also usually thought that, hey, he actually was, in 2016, he was considered the most moderate Republican nominee in a long time. Right. And so it's like showing, no, I mean, these people really are just very far right, not just and they believe all these conspiracies. And it's just, getting that into people's heads is the challenge right now. And that's what we're focused on every day.
Interesting. What are some ways you do that?
Well, we have kind of a political team that really works really closely with our allies in state, usually the caucuses, to kind of make sure that people know about that. And so a lot of what we do is we try to fund that work, either by sending money directly to campaigns through our Give Smart program, or we also have a Giving Circles program where people want to get together with their friends and raise money together, for the states. We can help with that as well. And you can check out both of those programs at our website, statesproject.org.
Talk to me a little bit more about Minnesota. I mean, it's a state that I'm endlessly fascinated with. I've been heartened by their sort of rejection of Trump, particularly. Mm-hmm. I must say I was a little bit alarmed at how close Ilhan Omar's primary was. What's going on in Minnesota from your perspective?
So what's going on in Minnesota? You have a gubernatorial nominee, Scott Jensen, who very regressive candidate. He supported a total ban on abortion. He's not trying to walk that back. But he's on tape saying he supports that. His running mate, Matt Burke, who you might remember as a member of the Minnesota Vikings, he's even more, he's even more extreme than Jensen. And what I've noticed in Minnesota is that a lot of the state legislative candidates take their cues from them. And they, so you have a very, regressive GOP ticket in Minnesota. And also, Jensen is notably pretty anti-vax. And you're seeing a lot of very anti-vax state legislative nominees falling off of him. Also, Minnesota, as you may know, is home to pillow magnate Mike Lindell. Right. And he tends to be a pretty popular guy within Republican circles there. And so a lot of, again, and these are candidates in swing seats, candidates in seats that were decided by like 1 or 2 points in the last election, are cozying up to, Lindell and Jensen and Burke. And, it's just, we got to, get the word out to all the people in the state that, hey, the GOP ticket in Minnesota has some deeply right-wing views that are very out of step with the state and very different from Minnesota. Does have a tradition of like moderate Republicans, actually, decades ago. A lot of, former Minnesota Republicans have since, like, they endorsed like Clinton in 16 and Biden in 20. These aren't those Republicans. And even though people sometimes vote at the state legislative like they are, and so it's just getting into people's heads, hey, these are really dangerous candidates right now.
Yeah, I can say like the Minnesota GOP is more like, to me, it whiffs of like white nationalist more than like even the Dakotas. They seem a little bit more like podunk and like not quite as like evolved ideologically. There's some dark stuff going on in the Minnesota GOP, that and the anti-vax stuff. Am I too quick to celebrate the death of anti-vax as a political campaign
Yes.
issue? Yeah, okay, go on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I've met some great lawmakers from the Dakotas working very hard. It's it's tough there, but they're doing their best. Minnesota, yeah, and so I mean, it's not the thing about it. It's like it's not like thankfully, I don't see it as like an issue necessarily. I don't think they're not using it to peel off Democratic voters in a way I fear that they might have done maybe like earlier this year. It seems to have faded away, and again, because politicizing vaccination would be just about one of the worst things that could happen to the health of this country. But that doesn't mean those views against vaccination have gone away. They're just not being put front and center anymore. And so again, it is a really concerning group of candidates there, and Minnesota could see some really kind of terrible public health outcomes if the Republican Party there can, make headway in this election.
And you think there's a decent chance of them doing so? Like I saw a poll that showed Walls up quite a bit, but
18.
do you think that?
Yeah, and so I think the thing about polls, what we've seen over the past few years is that polls in the Midwest have been just like really unreliable. I think it's just been very hard to model the electorate in the Midwest because it's a little more homogenous than it is in other states. And so because of that, polls have been off. I mean, I think most people in state do think that Governor Walz is ahead right now, but I don't think anyone thinks he's actually ahead 18 points. And similarly, if he wins, but then Republicans hold the legislature there, it still could create a lot of problems for the state. They did run a bit behind him in 2018 when he first ran for election. So it still is just really important to make sure that people know how radical the entire Republican ticket is in that state.
Any other sort of, I guess, not red legislatures, but legislatures where we can move to be a little bit more offensive for good? Is there any races we should be keeping an eye on in that front?
Well, I would say, Maine is one where, we helped flip them in 2018. And since then, Maine's been on a tear. They capped insulin prices, something that the federal government wouldn't do. But, Maine got done at the states. They've done a lot on clean water and clean air and lowering other ways to lower healthcare prices. They've been doing really well. And Maine is a state where also you really kind of can see what a difference you can make at the state legislative level versus the federal. Because if you look at how much money Sarah Gideon had left over, let alone spent left over in her account, we spent 1% of that in 2020 on the state Senate there, and we are actually able to expand the majority. And again, so it's like really, if you focus on the states, you can just make so much more of an impact. But the issue, hey, it's you never know how a midterm when your party holds the presidency is going to go. And their new state house map, Trump actually carried a majority of the districts on it in 2016. So there's a chance that they could really undo all that. So in Maine, it's really we're kind of protecting what we've done so far. If we can keep kind of electing good legislatures in Maine, they can keep making progress and keep doing great things. They're really kind of a model.
So, I mean, we talked a little bit about maybe some of the issues that are worth hitting, but like, in your seat as you're watching the country, I mean, how are you feeling about both money that's being raised and potential turnout? Particularly for like those races that aren't the sexiest. Like I know, like here in Texas, obviously everyone's paying a lot of attention to the Beto race. But if you look down ballot for the statewide offices, which are also really important, like
Yeah.
pumping up the numbers that Rochelle Garza is getting, or any of these other folks, would be a huge difference compared to the amount of money that Beto is able to sort of fundraise over there. I'm just curious, general litmus, how you're feeling about turnout and fundraising going into this midterm.
Yeah. So really kind of, it's funny, like the widespread feeling among practitioners really across the ideological spectrum this year is that turnout's going to be huge. Though that's kind of a relative thing because like it's going to be bigger than 2018. Well, in 2018, turnout was I think what, like 53%. So it's actually like relatively, but it's just it's going to be a high turnout for a midterm. I think is generally what people think. But at the same time, both sides can turn out, and so we still need to turn out our people. I think definitely overturning, one unfortunate fact is Roe was overturned. Dobbs is the law of the land, and that, but it has energized a lot of people who maybe weren't necessarily as invested in it, and especially around states because they're seeing just how much of their lives are governed, not from DC but from their state capital. And so, it is heartening to see, though I wish I could guarantee more. And I think the money is a similar thing where it's heartening to see that people really have been receptive to our message, that states really matter, that you can make such a big difference there. But we, like there's still, right now there's about $1.6 billion in dark money floating around out there by the same people who are really the architects of the GOP strategy to run really regressive policy through states. And so, it's a run through the tape thing, and and so we're keeping at it. So if you want to help out, again, please go to statesproject.org.
I'm trying to think. Is there any states that we haven't covered that you think we should nod toward?
Yeah. So a couple of other states where we're trying to protect majorities are Alaska and Nevada. Nevada, again, that's another state that's made a lot of really great headway on a lot of different issues, especially things like democracy. In a tough year, and that's a state too where if kind of the trends around Latino voters continue at their current pace, you could see a bit of a regression there as well. So we're working hard to maintain that majority. Similarly, in Alaska's a really interesting state. I think you saw with the recent U.S. House election, they have a new electoral system that really can help defeat the furthest right candidates, which is really exciting. And also in the state house there today, there's actually a coalition of Democrats, independents, and kind of civic-minded Republicans who are willing to join together and run that chamber and really stop their governor, who's really pretty far right, his worst excesses. And so those are two states that as well. And then similarly, there's North Carolina and Nebraska. Those are states where actually supermajority thresholds are really important. In North Carolina, you have a Democratic governor who's willing to stand up on a lot of really important issues, especially around reproductive freedom. But if Republicans can just flip, I think it's just 2 more seats, or really, if they flip any more seats, it really kind of puts some of his vetoes at risk. And so not only just kind of protecting against supermajority, but ideally even gaining seats, because even in a good year, it'd be possible to win a majority in their state house there. So North Carolina is a state where it's really important to, at the very least, prevent a supermajority. And then in Nebraska, the only state with only one legislative chamber, you have a supermajority threshold for the state budget, and you have a filibuster, pretty strong filibuster tradition. And so if you can prevent a supermajority there, and they're just 1 seat away from that, you can really prevent a lot of the worst things. And people don't think about the state budget a lot in terms of improving lives, but that thing is in any state, that's such a huge deal for people who live there every day. And so Nebraska is really a critical state too.
And from one final question, from your perspective of somebody interested in winning elections for candidates and helping them win elections, how helpful has active, Dark Brandon been for the Democrats? Like, has that been noticeable? Like the student loan stuff and maybe some of the climate stuff and minor stuff. Is that noticeable or is it not noticeable?
It's fine. Like, I believe in vibes. I believe vibes are huge and good vibes are good. I will say this too, is in my job, a lot more of my job is keeping an eye on the far right and helping out, kind of fight against them. Less there are other people on my team that do more kind of working within the Democratic campaigns. And one thing I've noticed is that over the past month, the far right really has had the wind taken out of their sails a little bit. And so I do believe that the vibes overall are better. They're scrambling a little bit, and I think we just need to keep our foot on the gas. Need to kind of keep hammering away at just kind of like what a group of really dangerous people they've nominated, and hopefully and I am hopeful that the American people will reject these forms of kind of far right politics that have cropped up, and I'm hopeful as a country that we keep making progress.
Very good. Aaron Kleinman. Aaron is the Director of Research at the States Project US, at States Project US. You can follow him at Bobby Big Wheel on Twitter. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt and David.
I really appreciate it.